Yesterday, the president of Russia offers Ukraine and the collective West an end to the 2-year-long war in Eastern Europe, and today the Biden administration says, go Putin yourself. Well, not a big surprise here, but let's look at this together anyhow. And it's revealing, after all, with what kind of reasoning now the neocons are coming up to say, like, oh, no, 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 it's impossible to negotiate. So there's this interesting article in the New York Times. And if you watched the video from yesterday, you know that the New York Times actually picked up on this one point, which a lot of other newspapers, I'm realizing today, are skipping. A lot of other Western media are skipping the point that Putin officially said that he's willing and ready to negotiate with Ukraine and with the US too, if they desire to do so, and even to do so in a face-saving way. And he will that the most important thing is actually to end the war, and the war will end with negotiations. Anyhow, they skipped that. The New York Times, funnily enough, they pick up on it, but of course today they have official statements from the White House. US rejects Putin's latest call for Ukraine negotiations because skepticism remains high about the Russian leader's intentions after he told Tucker Carlson that the war in Ukraine could be settled with a peace deal. All right, so we know where the article is going to go, right? And of course, it starts with with the Biden administration, which was now really pressed to actually say something. And why I like this this development is that now the U.S. and the neocons are actually in a corner because they're not used to being taken advantage of by propaganda from the other side, and even then distributed within their own media, which is why they're so angry. And look, at this point, all and any form of public display of what you think is good in politics is propaganda. So, I mean, all sides are doing it, and I don't think that at this point we can talk about news anymore without keeping constantly in mind that everything has propagandistic value. So, because anything else, I mean, the idea that there's objective journalism, etc., that's like one of the weapons of the collective West, right? So when I say propaganda, then I mean that the political speech and news with the political purposes. So the Biden administration dismissed on Friday a call by President Vladimir Putin of Russia for negotiations. Of course, what else? Because they love war. They love war. They do it. And then the question is, so how do they dismiss it, and how do they still try to spin it around to make themselves look as if they were the good guys, right? They're saying the article then quotes Putin, right, by saying, we're willing to negotiate, Mr. Putin told Mr. Carlson. So the journalist who wrote this actually is interested in the fact that that this was offered by the Russian leader. But it continues, it is not the first time Mr. Putin has expressed willingness to negotiate over the fate of Ukraine. Also, this is good that they picked this up, that actually this has been, as other analysts have been saying, Alexander Mercury's and so on, we've learned nothing inherently new through the Tucker Carlson video, maybe with the exception, I think I've learned that Vladimir Putin is still willing to use the Istanbul agreement as a basis to go forward, because he keeps saying, like, we had something there, right? But there's not that much news for anyone who has been following the speeches of the Russian president of the past, and the Russians in general. So this is something that also the New York Times now actually has to admit and actually come back to, and then needs to explain away, right? So Biden officials say they are not entertaining the idea of pressing Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky to negotiate with Mr. Putin. I mean, why would they? They're not party of the war, right? In their own delusional little mindset, or their delusional propaganda. Both we and President Zelensky have said numerous times that we believe this war will end through negotiations, a national security spokesman said in a statement. Despite Mr. Putin's words, we have seen no actions to indicate he's interested in ending this war. If he would pull back his forces and stop his ceaseless attacks on Ukraine. So, okay, this is the first way how they try to spin it, right? Saying that ending the war in Ukraine would mean no more Russian troops on Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, everything liberated, and Vladimir Putin in front of a war criminal tribunal, right? Because that's still the peace formula that they officially cling to, which was this delusional approach that even like a month ago in Switzerland, Davos, was discussed as an honest peace plan, right? So they cling to this, saying like, as long as Putin doesn't agree to these terms, then there's obviously no appetite for peace negotiations. But that's not how negotiations function, right? You do understand that, collective West. But they still pretend that that's what it is. And then, of course, they have to bring up Donald Trump and saying like, oh, Putin is just waiting for Trump to win the election and then give in to everything Mr. Putin asked for. US officials have also long insisted that despite the more than $75 billion the United States has supplied to Ukraine, it is not for Washington to dictate whether Kiev engages in peace talks and what terms on. Ultimately, it's up to Ukraine to decide its path on negotiations, the National Security Council statement said. This is the height of hypocrisy, knowing that it was Boris Johnson, at the behest of the US and NATO, that torpedoed the original Istanbul Agreement. So this is the big middle finger from the West to Vladimir Putin, right? And also the fact that this journalist doesn't pick up on this point, that nobody talks about the Istanbul agreements, right? And where they were and what were the reasons that they broke down, and that this was that Ukraine had been pushed into this war in the first place, and then is being kept in it and is being used as cannon fodder, right? That side of the story is not only not being talked about, it is utterly ignored. So this is to me the height of hypocrisy, is still pretending that it is Ukraine that decides. And whenever Ukraine is about to decide something that the United States doesn't like, you either have a coup, as 2014 on the Maidan, or you have Boris Johnson flying over there. And by now it is utterly clear that Joe Biden, while he was vice president, was basically in charge of Ukraine. And he even got the head prosecutor over there fired because the guy had the audacity to look into Hunter Biden's dealings with that oil company or whatever that was. And still, we are at a point where the collective West pretends that it has nothing to do. It just supports, If Ukraine asks, then the West will help because it's Ukraine that takes all decisions. Ridiculous, knowing that even the HIMARS can fire at targets without getting support from the from the people delivering the operational intelligence and helping with the systems, right? It is utterly ridiculous. But okay, this just means that it is a no, right? Putin said, you want to negotiate? And the West says, no, we don't. We're still keeping up the farce, and publicly to propagandize our own population, we keep pretending that everything is as we've been painting it for the last 10 years. And then the article actually quotes and talked to Sergei Radchenko, a Russian historian at Johns Hopkins, who said a couple of things which disappoint me, because Sergei Radchenko is actually a good historian whose papers I read and whose analysis of history of Russian foreign relations I value. But Mr. Radchenko said Mr. Putin might be engaged in what during Soviet times was known as peace offensive, trying to pretend that you want peace, but just abuse that in order to then gain tactical victories later on. Some Western officials believe Mr. Putin may also have his domestic audience in mind when he talks about a negotiated end to the war. Polls in Russia have shown that Russian citizens would welcome a settlement to end the conflict that has shaken their economy. Shaken their economy. They're doing best all over Europe, but the New York Times people and the propagandists still need to cling to the idea that the economy is, as Alex Christoforou would say, in tatters, right? That the economy is doing so bad, when in fact the economy is actually doing wonderfully. It's a war economy. It's booming at the moment. But okay, so apparently the Russians are still suffering so badly, and of course tens of thousands of casualties. This one is true. I mean that the Russians are bleeding and that this is bad for Russia, that is also true, and that the Russians want this war to end is also true. Nobody has in Russia has an interest in having this war going as long as possible because it is horrible, it is attrition, and most Russians have family or people they know in Ukraine. I mean, I have in Japan so far met several Russians who either work for the embassy or whatnot, and most of them either are somehow used to living in Ukraine or have family in Ukraine. For Russians, this is horrible. What is the statistics? About a third of all Russians have ties to Ukraine. I mean, you don't want this. That the Russians don't want this, that is utterly true. So therefore, a peace agreement would be something nice. But here we see again like how the West is trying to rationalize. Can you see it, right? First, Putin doesn't mean it. He's just trying to deceive us. Secondly, he's just playing to his own domestic audience. That's why he proposed this in the Tucker Carlson interview. The West tries to rationalize the peace offer away. You try to explain it why it is not real, right? And then you can continue with business as usual. Talk of peace could also win Mr. Putin favor among nations in the so-called global south. It's funny that he calls it the so-called global south. I mean, global south is today is an official expression that is fine to be used in order to talk about countries that are not part of the so-called collective West. And so that's the other one. Okay, Mr. Putin just wants to talk to the other guys, right? He doesn't mean it. It's not sincere. Nobody knows for sure, and nobody can know for sure unless they try. Mr. Charab said. This is interesting. So this Charab guy is actually a little bit more positive. He added that it was notable that Mr. Putin has not told Mr. Carlson that he had preconditions for talks, such as the removal for Mr. Zelensky's government. Which is true. Actually, that's something that Vladimir Putin didn't say. And it's interesting that the article points this out, which just tells me that the journalist who wrote this actually reached out to a couple of people he knew, like Radchenko and this Charab guy, and they gave him a couple of information, and he had to type up this article as soon as possible. So he doesn't actually try to really just create blatant propaganda. It's just pretty clear that the intention of the article is to kind of explain to the collective West, to people who can't understand what's this peace offer about, and still explain it away within the mindset of, well, at the end of the day, we all know that Putin is evil and therefore he can't mean it, and so on and so forth. So he also, in the end, barring a Ukrainian demand signal for peace talks, there's unlikely to be a push from Washington, he says. So the article ends with the point that Ukraine makes absolutely independent decisions, and it has nothing to do with the West. Although we all know that if there was some form of backdoor negotiations ongoing, and the US didn't like that, we know that this would be sabotaged instantly, immediately. We know today, thanks to the archives that have been opened, that there were peace talks actually between North and South Vietnam going on at the time, and that just 6 weeks or 7 weeks before Kennedy himself was shot, Kennedy gave the green light for eliminating Diem in the South, who was nearing some form of agreement with the North, and that was nothing that the Kennedy administration wanted. Therefore, they said yes to the generals who wanted to get rid of him. And this has been, of course, a Damocles sword over Zelensky for the entire time, and pretending that that Ukraine is an absolutely independent actor and had nothing to do with anyone else is as hypocritical as it gets. But the Tucker Carlson interview really made the neocons angry, very angry, because they're really not used to being beaten at their own game. And Vladimir Putin hasn't tried for the last 2 years to actually score points in the West. I mean, Vladimir Putin doesn't care about the opinion of public opinion in the West, because he knows he can't control the public opinion. He cannot influence it very much. I mean, the other team is much better at doing that. The United States for 100 years has fantastic track record of painting itself as the, the savior of the First World War, the savior of the Second World War, the provider of NATO and global goods and blue jeans and Elvis Presley. I mean, people have officially coined the term soft power, right, in order to describe the way in which the United States has been successful in really gluing its peripheral states to itself so that they don't want to really escape. And at the moment, we see the height of that, right, to the point where the Germans are willing to ignore that probably NATO members blew up their infrastructure project, to the point where nations are willing to think about like throwing themselves into war in order to please the Americans and actually give up bases and undermine their own national interests in order to please Uncle Sam. But this is new for them, that Vladimir Putin actually gets prime time speaking time, and that a big part of the American public will actually listen because their attention has been pointed to it. So even the UK Prime Minister had to hit back at Putin, and says it's clearly ridiculous, the NATO expansion claim. Let's look at this. Rishi Sunak says Russia conducted an illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Unprovoked again for 2 years. Unprovoked. Why is that adjective still there? Why do we need that adjective? But fine. If it wasn't provoked, why do we still need to be reminded that it was unprovoked? I mean, we're so ridiculous. But they keep to the phrasing, right? They must have these kind of little info sheets that go around and say like, what's the lingo that you're supposed to use, everybody, when you talk about something. I'm proud that the UK has stood strong with Ukraine from the beginning. And then of course Sunak says, we can't let this type of behavior go unchecked. It impacts all of our security. So, okay, UK, together with the United States, provider of international security, right? The police men of the world, and we will not let this happen. When we bomb and invade Iraq, then that is fine. When somebody else does something that we don't like, then we gonna go and tell them off that they can do that. No, because we are ruling the world. We, United Kingdom, with the Americans, yes, but we rule the world. Therefore, it is ours to give and ours to judge. And CNN. CNN, Putin walks away with propaganda victory after Tucker Carlson's softball interview. Ooh, they are so angry. They're angry at the fact that somebody that they don't want to be heard, Vladimir Putin, like explaining what is happening from the Russian viewpoint and from his viewpoint, and what the whole rationale is, and even then how to end this catastrophe, right? They don't want that to be heard, and they go ballistic, right? In some cases, Carlson even fed into Putin's narratives. For instance, Putin advanced an absurd deep state conspiracy theory that the US government is not controlled by its elected leaders, but by unelected powers at the Central Intelligence Agency who direct the president like a puppet from the shadows. And we are really supposed to believe that the entire permanent state in the US, these bureaucrats, etc., who are being put in place and who are there for decades, and the neocons are just so good at that. What's of entrenching themselves in the system, and we are supposed to believe that they have no influence on the political process whatsoever, but and calling that a conspiracy theory, just saying that the United States as a country is not as easily maneuverable as a ship where the captain actually steers it, right? That's not how it works. You have like thousands and tens of thousands of people who interlock with each other and then create actual like foreign policy and the way that the state moves. And Vladimir Putin in the interview just said, I had several of these instances where the Western leaders tell me something, the United States top leader at the time told me something, and then something completely different happened. So what are we supposed to make out of that? So look, the neocons, they are well entrenched, like Victoria Nuland. Victoria Nuland has been around forever, for the last 20 years, and she just moves higher and higher and higher. And she was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine when the Maidan happened, and we have her on tape. So we don't need any kind of pretense that these second and third tier officials don't also hold a certain sway of power over the political process. It's not just the military-industrial complex. It is not just the money. It is also the people in lower positions that are permanent, that are not elected officials, but that are permanent bureaucrats who hold certain powers. And that pointing that out is already counters conspiracy theory. That is also quite revealing about the mindset of these people. So in general, what can we say? The neocons are really angry. The neocons try to rationalize it away, and the neocons are clearly saying no to the peace offer, to the offer for negotiations. We also know that this is inconsequential. It doesn't matter, because Vladimir Putin, I'm pretty sure, didn't really put any kind of sincere hope into swaying the entire American population with the interview, and then tomorrow they'll push for peace negotiations. That's not it. This was obviously just one of the an interview that he thought would probably not hurt, and will maybe even help. And well, if it doesn't hurt and if it helps, then all the better. But Putin and Russia at this point does not hold any kind of hope into a sudden awakening of the Europeans or the American general public. That's just not how politics works. How it works is that you create fact on the ground, obviously, and then you push your opponent until he moves in a way that you can accept and agree to. And that's still what they're doing. It is just interesting to see this public drama, and also see how, like, the neocons, when they're then pushed into a public corner themselves, how they lash out, even to the point where they publicly fantasize about maybe Tucker Carlson then being banned from the EU, or being like treated as a spy under the Espionage Act. All of that was out in the open the last couple of days. It will probably not happen. We'll see what will go on. But the neocons are furious, and let me say, happy about that. They deserve it. They deserve the blame for this, because they are to blame. This war was not necessary. This war didn't need to happen. This war is a catastrophe and should be ended. And if they say no and continue saying no, just makes it worse.